The former U.S. Secretary of Defense, William Perry, wrote an impassioned submission for a supervisory board meeting of the International Luxembourg Forum in Geneva on preventing nuclear catastrophe. I can still remember the disbelief and the joy as I watched young Berliners tear down the Berlin Wall. I thought that now we would finally leave behind us the dreaded fear, the fear of a nuclear holocaust, and now we would begin the dismantlement of the deadly Cold War nuclear arsenal. During the period of the 1990s when I was the Secretary of Defense, we actually dismantled 8,000 nukes. It seemed that we were well on our way to dismantling the deadly nuclear legacy of the Cold War and to forming a cooperative relationship with Russia. But the dismantlement stopped in 1997, shortly after I left office as Secretary of Defense. And in 2001, we started backsliding. Today, the US and Russia are rebuilding their Cold War nuclear arsenals. We have returned to the Cold War dangers I thought we had left behind. How in God's name could we have let this happen? And what can we do to turn it around? The answer to the first question is complex. I will dismiss it by observing that during the last 2 decades, both Russia and the US took unwise actions. I found plenty of blame to go around. The danger of a nuclear catastrophe occurring today is greater than it was during the Cold War, because leaders and people in both of our countries simply do not understand how dangerous it has become. In despair of our political leaders taking appropriate actions, I started a large-scale education program to educate people in the world about nuclear dangers. I am taking ideas from my book and putting them in online courses, videos and podcasts accessible to a broader audience. The videos are depictions of my nuke nightmares, how a nuclear catastrophe could happen, such as a regional nuclear war or a nuclear terror attack, and what its consequences would be. I offer specific ideas on how to lower danger, end launch-on warning, revoke presidential sole authority, stop the new nuclear arms race. And I understand that no one can resolve this huge problem by himself or herself, but each of us can try. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. I don't expect to see the fruits of my work during my lifetime, but I have a dozen good reasons for keeping at it. My 8 grandchildren and my 4 great-grandchildren. I'm working for them and for all the other grandchildren on the planet. I am 92 years old, but I will continue to work on this existential problem as long as I am able. And I know that my colleagues in the Luxembourg Forum are working with me to rid the world of this existential danger. What we are doing is lonely and it is frustrating, but it could not be more important. William Perry's formulation was very precise. The Luxembourg Forum focused its efforts on the main area, how to prevent a potential nuclear conflict. But what this community of leading, world-class experts is doing is indeed lonely. Both policymakers and ordinary people seem to have lost any fear of the nuclear danger, and that is the surest route to nuclear catastrophe. The Luxembourg Forum has been running for more than 10 years. Before, forum participants gave priority to developing practical proposals for national leaders, the UN, and other major international organizations on reducing the nuclear danger. Now they also face another concern: how to warn the public at large about the potential catastrophe. Moshe Kantor, founder of the International Luxembourg Forum, opened a supervisory board meeting by focusing on the key point. You are all perfectly aware of the crisis in this area, the demise of the indefinite term INF Treaty, the uncertainty of the new START renewal, the United States' exit from the Iran deal, and sanctions against those who are still cooperating with Iran under the deal, the lack of resolutions on the denuclearization of North Korea, President Trump's intention to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty, and the lack of any dialogue or negotiations on these key issues are of our great concern. The increasing uncertainty in all these areas reminds me of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that without corrective action, the entropy in a system always increases, or in layman's terms, in any system left by itself, order decreases, and disorder increases. In all our declarations, we always try to initiate the actions required to decrease entropy. The Rome Declaration says that the degradation of strategic stability in combination with the demise of key arms control treaties is happening simultaneously with building crises and wars across the globe, which may result in out-of-control escalation. That today the threat of a nuclear catastrophe is higher than it ever was during the Cold War. The threat is not so much that nuclear weapons will be used deliberately, but that a war may be started because of a human mistake, a system error, misunderstanding or miscalculation. These risks are heightened with new cyber technology. The Luxembourg Forum experts' reckoning shows that absolutely nothing, including the development of new weapons, prevents the extension of the Russian-US Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 3, which expires in February 2021. Unless the United States and Russia extend the treaty or enter into a new one, the nuclear arms race will become uncontrolled. As for the Trump administration's demands to include China in the negotiation process, we can only recommend that the US and Russia reach a bilateral agreement, and only after that offer China any acceptable avenues of cooperation in nuclear arms control, taking into consideration its utmost reticence in this area. Trump will make a decision next year. No one knows what he will decide, probably even Trump himself, because, as defined by Americans themselves, Trump is an experiment for the United States, as well as for all others generally. Resolution of other issues, the effects of actions taken in respect of the Iran deal, are also critical issues because the US leaders impose sanctions on the states that participated in the deal pursuant to the UN Security Council resolution and that cooperate with Iran in other areas. Our recommendation is to continue and maintain this cooperation with Iran on any level, because if that cooperation fails, Iran will be able to develop nuclear weapons in a relatively short time, and that would be a catastrophe. The USA unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 agreement with Iran that had stopped its nuclear program. Today, Iran is restoring it at a rapid pace. Iran has already enriched uranium beyond the key limit envisaged by the JCPOA. Unless this pressing issue is resolved, Iran will eventually build nuclear weapons, which it sees as a crucial factor in reinforcing its status as a regional leader and strengthening its fight against Israel, which is in essence an extremely dangerous hotbed of new confrontation, considering Israel's likely response. Moshe Kantor is also president of the European Jewish Congress and president of the World Holocaust Forum Foundation. It's no wonder that, describing the present situation, William Perry emphasized the need to avoid a nuclear holocaust, as he puts it. I think that it stands to reason, as in his numerous actions, including videos of his nightmares, such as a potential local conflict between India and Pakistan, and how that conflict escalates into a global conflict, or how a local nuclear terrorist attack in Washington develops into a global conflict. The idea that runs like a scarlet thread through his conclusions is that there are no local nuclear conflicts at all, as they inevitably escalate into a global nuclear conflict. I uphold the same position. To my mind, the Iran-Israel situation, which regrettably was not one of Perry's nightmares but is surely one of mine, is very similar. The fact that for about 90 days, Israel has not had a government that could deal effectively with internal or external affairs, rather than political infighting, does not add to balanced or soothing decision-making in the event of a potential conflict, because, as we know, Iran has already gone beyond the limits of the nuclear deal and practically overtly is heading to develop nuclear weapons. Israel's position is also known. Under no circumstances will it allow Iran to do it. Israel will deliver a preventative nuclear strike. In this regard, I have a question. Perhaps the Luxembourg Forum should state our special position in respect of this conflict situation. However, it is not only the boiling Middle East that risks a nuclear war. Today in Europe, which only yesterday seemed the safest region in the world, with developed security systems, security dialogue, the Helsinki process and many other fine aspects of organization of the process, today all of this has, if not collapsed, then seriously decayed. and no one knows how to restore it. Quite unexpectedly, today Europe has become a source or place of origin of potential escalation of conflict. President of the Luxembourg Forum, Vячеславом Kantorом, outlined what else should be done to stop the arms race and Cold War. It is advisable to keep repeating the recommendation to avoid large-scale military exercises and the accumulation of weapons and military equipment near borders as a step to ease tensions. Promoting remaining contacts between military and diplomatic bodies may contribute to that end. The words of the former US Secretary of Defense, William Perry, about the loneliness of those who realize the scope and tangibility of nuclear threat were repeatedly cited at the Supervisory Board meeting. What can be done to make people realize the reality?
I think if we want to look at the future of arms control negotiation and possibility of limiting the risk of nuclear war, it's unavoidable to put this in the framework of the world we are living in today. And that world is characterized, seems to me, if we leave aside the economic, financial, and technological changes that are profoundly changing humanity and which are rarely mentioned in arms control and strategic grouping, but they are changing our people. So if we leave aside these societal and economic, financial and demographic changes, all of which are extremely important, and if we concentrate only on the security aspect of the world system, then it seems to me the analysis is that we are facing a tri-dimensional systemic crisis. The first dimension is, of course, the deterioration of what used to be East-West, essentially US-Russian and European-Russian relations over the last 25 years. It's a long time already. The second major factor is the general deterioration of the security of the world as a result of outside factors, mostly Islam and China. And the last element of this systemic crisis is the possibility of a new technological arms race, which was touched this morning. So I will very quickly go through these three elements before trying to look at the potential for reviving this arms control process. On the deterioration of US-Russian and European-Russian relations, we all have in mind the long series, and I've noted at least 9 yardstick in that escalation to nowhere that we are seeing, from the Balkans in the 1990s to the enlargement of NATO in 1997, to the abandonment of the ABM Treaty, to the Putin speech at the MSC in 2007, the suspension of CFE by Russia, the invasion of Georgia the following year in 2008, the intervention in Libya, pressed by France and followed by NATO in 2011, and of course the Crimean situation, Crimean-Ukrainian situation since 2014, leading to the INF dismantling and JCPOA dismantling this year, or last year and this year. So at this stage, the likelihood of massive improvement in all of this is at the very least hypothetical. NATO, as you can see today, is extremely divided on the Russian question. I am glad that the President of France finally understood that you need to talk to the Russian and reopen a dialogue. It's a good thing. Unfortunately, Europe is split. There are those who consider that the threat is from the south, with France, and those who consider with the Balts and the Poles that the Russian bear is back. And therefore, these are the guys who want to continue sanctions and punishments and so on, and consider the relationship with Russia as a punishment and not as something that is in our interest. I happen to believe it is in our interest. The possibility of improvement on the American side is just not there. Ironically, there is no consensus whatsoever left in American politics today, either internally or externally, except on one subject: hate the Russians. That's the only subject in which the Congress agrees. Every other subject, they are completely split. And that's a problem. Add to this another dimension, which is the fact that a lot of the policy against Russia is in the book of Congress, in the form of laws and sanctions, which are extremely hard to change. Even in tomorrow morning, Mr. Putin became an angel, withdrew from Ukraine, started kissing us all over the face and so on, and promised eternal peace. You could not change the laws in the Congress for many years. So the regime of sanction is going, unfortunately, to be a major obstacle for the future.
Today, public opinion is absolutely or practically indifferent to what is happening in the area of security in general and nuclear security in particular, unlike in the 1980s that we all remember well, although the danger now is much more grave than it was then.
It seems that society in many countries, and this I think is everywhere, not only in the developed north, but also in the undeveloped south, people are very much aware of the existence of nuclear weapons, very much aware of the threat that they may pose, but they're simply not willing to take any kind of action, collectively at least, against that. And I'm old enough to remember, and I was already an adult in the 1980s, demonstrations in New York City about the weapons in Europe. We never had anything else, anything further, on this count. But we do have a phenomenon which is very baffling in the modern world, which is whole populations rebelling against raise in the bus fares, or in the case of France, les Gilets Rouges. Now you had against the pension system. We had something like that in Chile recently. You have some things like that in Hong Kong. Why do these people so easily ignited about a question, about a problem, which then develops into a very large and kind of amorphous demonstration? What are they really against? They seem to be against many things, but you cannot say what they are for. What is it they are asking? They simply want to be happier. They seem to feel that the happiness has disappeared. And how was that possible? Because of internet, because of instant communication, because you can send a message to a number of people in less than 140 characters. You have to be very concise, no? And you cannot explain very much. Just say, well, we are against, and we are going to do something about this. And I think it's a phenomenon of the modern. Why this did not reach nuclear weapons or the security of what people don't feel secure in the existence of nuclear weapons? Why people don't feel insecure? People, on the contrary, as Des was talking, that other people have also mentioned, that people feel secure because nuclear weapons are there. If you ask public opinion, they'll say, well, okay, let's keep deterrence, it's very good. No, we feel secure. Sometimes myself, when I speak in my own quarters, in my own society, especially to young audiences, I always say, sometimes I try to finish with an analogy. And I try to say something like, well, if we don't do something serious about climate change, civilization may disappear in a couple of decades. But if we don't do something serious about nuclear weapons, it may disappear in a few seconds. But people don't seem to be troubled by that. They say, oh, yes, you're right, but they don't say. So this general feeling of unhappiness is what really baffles me. Why is it that people feel unhappy? maybe the promises of globalization did not materialize. Maybe people were have some kind of nostalgia for a previous period when they felt more happier. But this has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It's nothing to do with destruction. This is an issue, no problem. There's no problem there. The problems are elsewhere. And the only way you can not control, but influence public opinion is through the internet. There's no other way. That's how we influence. It's not discussing things here. It's not writing beautiful essays and publishing our articles. It's getting to the internet and trying to mobilize public opinion. Whether this is feasible, how do you do that? I simply do not know. It's past my time. I'm old enough not to be able to manage very well my own computer. But I think it is a phenomenon of the contemporary world that we have to be keen about. We have to try to understand better why these things happen and how you can use the modern technology to do something about it.
We tried a movie, Countdown to Zero. We hired the producer who produced An Inconvenient Truth for Al Gore. The conceit is that a movie that reached people might affect them to the same degree that An Inconvenient Truth managed to raise public interest in the issue of climate change. I think it was a good try, but it didn't work. So we're sort of in an experimental period in the technology and in theories of change on how to bring this all about. At Princeton, we have two really interesting projects that are based on virtual reality, one of which is an attempt to recreate the experience of the Hawaiians who a couple of years ago were notified over their cell phones that a ballistic missile had been fired, that it was going to impact Hawaii. And for something like 38 minutes, a certain amount of panic ensued, including parents who were lifting manhole covers in roads and putting their kids inside the sewers to try to protect them. We're also programming a virtual reality experience that's going to be unveiled at the Munich Security Conference in a couple of months that puts people in the hot seat of a decision maker who is told that her country is under attack. Here's the situation, here are your options, and put the person in the position of having to make a decision. In other words, a VR experience of launch on warning. It's possible that some of these technologies will be deeply impactful, and VR has certainly managed to prove that it affects the brain in a very different way, in a way that creates a searing experience about some of these things. So I think we need to continue to pursue some of these technologies to see where they go.
I would argue that, as important, if not more important, is the question of both a lack of trust and a lack of respect among countries. I've just been so struck at recent PrepCom meetings and at the most recent First Committee meeting about the total absence of what I try to instill in my students who are not professional negotiators, but that is to be respectful of other parties, to engage in a professional manner. And yet I find it increasingly difficult the more my student arms control negotiators in the simulation attempt to be realistic and to reflect the positions of the countries that they're playing, the more destructive they become in these simulation exercises. And the lesson that I derive from that, and what has really been my whole professional career, has been using role-playing as a means to listen to others, to empathize with others, to put oneself in another party's shoes. And I think there's a role for not only students, young students, but also for those policymakers, for ourselves, to listen more and to empathize. And with that in mind in particular, I want to second those who have asked us perhaps to turn more to some of our younger charges here to hear their perspectives, because I think we, for the most part, know what each other is going to say. We've heard it before. Sometimes we're more eloquent than we are at other times. But we really don't know, I think, how these issues are viewed by some very bright individuals who may be younger than we are, but that doesn't mean they may not have better ideas. And so I would really encourage us as much as possible to hear from them. They may, in fact, provide some insightful new approaches.
What can be done to increase concern about and interest in the threat of a nuclear apocalypse? Some propose a public opinion survey. What questions could be asked? Are you concerned about the threat of a nuclear war? Ask that question, and it may turn out that 60% know nothing and don't think about it. Another 30% will say they don't care about it, and 10% will say they don't know. Then the question will arise, what is your Luxembourg Forum for, if no one cares about it? Or one may ask, do you want to be secure from the danger of nuclear war? In that case, we might have other responses and ratios. But still, I do not see a decisive vote that could draw the attention of state leaders to discussions about the problem. Generally speaking, I don't know what can draw their attention now. A well-known American politician, when asked about the influence of their leader on the situation in the country, said, "Trump is an experiment." Like that, in one word. That is a very interesting definition, but it does not provide an answer to the question of how long the experiment may continue. In Germany, it continued long enough, and with disastrous consequences. We cannot yet say how the American experiment may end. Different opinions are expressed as to whether it will continue until next year or longer. In Russia, the influence of public opinion on the group of leaders is minimized. They have quite a clear-cut idea of their understanding of the current situation, and no public opinion, whatever it may be, can have any impact on them. Under the circumstances, unless, as one of our well-known satirist writers said when it turned out that people were absolutely indifferent, to attract their attention, a bomb detonates. But that's wishful thinking. So much for public opinion and drawing attention to the problem. There is an increasing fashion for arms control gravediggers. Before, there was fashion for dresses, while now it's like this. It is progressively growing, covering ever more experts, including, regrettably, young experts. It should not be ignored, because without arms control ideology, we will not be able to go ahead, and we pin our great hopes on the young generation representatives who are present in this room and every now and again ask intelligent questions. For the first time, the supervisory board of the Luxembourg Forum was attended by young experts, with the best recommendations and interested listeners, who not only asked many questions, but also developed their own draft proposal on what should be done to stop the nuclear danger. This year, we established a Luxembourg Forum youth section in response to the idea voiced at the previous conference for engaging younger members. We brought in worthy experts recommended by the supervisory board. Some of them are here today. We hope that this will help them develop their creativity and offer extraordinary solutions to our common problems. The supervisory board meeting participants emphasized that the arms control and non-proliferation crisis had undermined strategic and regional stability. The present crisis is by no means incidental. Just 5 years ago, people who are dealing with these issues, who care about the control of nuclear weapons, knew what was going to happen. In the last decade, a powerful pressure group has been formed both in the USA and Russia, and in other countries, for the development of new arms systems, nuclear and non-nuclear, and for no limitations. Their position was based on political, strategic, and technical reasons, and therefore this line, which now begins to prevail in great powers, is very strong. When we are among our colleagues, forums like ours, it seems to us that we all are at one in our understanding of the importance of arms control and the need to maintain it. Regrettably, in our countries, we are the minority. while the majority believe that former agreements were either unfair, as can often be heard in Russia, or unnecessary, as the situation has changed and we do not need any arms control, or need some so far unclear but new instruments, methods, and forms of such control. The latter position has become widespread in Russia, for instance. I think that political leaders pay heed to such arguments. Crises have always been surrounded by myths. The present arms control crisis is no exception. The first myth is that new technology is immune to arms control and therefore the old methods should be rejected and some new ones developed. Second, new arms systems and technology are developed too quickly, and we are unable to develop it because arms control negotiations drag on for years, as experience shows. Then treaties are to be ratified, and meanwhile new systems have already been developed that actually neutralize or even nullify the effects of such treaties. Another myth is that a multipolar nuclear world made bilateral control of nuclear weapons unacceptable, as was the case before between the Soviet Union and the USA, and between Russia and the USA. However, we should also think about more fundamental long-term problems. So, new arms are uncontrollable. But new arms and new technology have always been developed. During the last 50 years of the existence of controls of nuclear weapons, they have continuously been bringing the disturbing effect into negotiations and strategic balance. However, given goodwill, we coped with it. Or take the development of ballistic missiles, then many-headed ballistic missiles, followed by cruise missiles. President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, they were all innovative technology that initially seemed to be able to destroy arms control. But then it turned out that they could be controlled quite successfully. The emerging technology that gives rise to concern is not so very uncontrollable. For some, agreement can be reached, given willingness and political will. For others, it may yet be impossible. But before, too, arms control was not a universal solution. It could not solve the problem of improving the accuracy of nuclear weapons, nuclear yield, tactical nuclear weapons, anti-satellite systems, and many other problems. But that does not mean it was useless. To my mind, in the last 50 years, arms control had won a number of historic victories. If negotiations were discontinued for many years, we are doomed to retardation. If they are resumed and intensified, we can reach an agreement on many issues. The 2010 New START, Prague Treaty, was actually concluded during negotiations, within 1 year, because there was a strong will to conclude it, due to the fact that the old treaty had lost its relevance. Multipolarity is another myth. True, the world has become multipolar, less controllable. But if it comes to the nuclear dimension of this multipolar world, and it is this dimension that arms controls deal with, there are no revolutionary changes there. When START 1 was concluded in 1991, the two nuclear superpowers accounted for 98% of the global nuclear arsenal, in terms of the number of warheads. When the Prague Treaty, START 3, the last bilateral treaty, was concluded, the two superpowers accounted for 95%. While now they account for about 92% of the global nuclear arsenal. You must admit that these are not revolutionary changes. They are marginal changes. While the total number of nuclear armaments worldwide had been reduced radically in the last 30 years, practically tenfold, and that is the historic victory of 50 years of arms controls.
All serious thinkers believe there is a crisis in arms control and in non-proliferation, and that they are likely to have, if not already having, an impact on strategic stability. I mean, earlier last week I attended the Berlin Policy Forum, where I was asked to mediate an international panel on arms control in the 21st century, with an emphasis on modern technology, which the German government have a particular interest in. The agenda stated simply, and I think these words put this very easily for us, although they require expansion, but the agenda said for this particular item on the discussion, and I read this short: the erosion of arms control regimes and fears of a new global arms race, amplified by technological trends, pose a fundamental challenge to strategic stability in the 21st century. New actors have emerged that have a significant impact on global peace and security. It goes on from there, but it would be tedious to read the last couple of other sentences. Interestingly, the panel discussion with representatives from Europe, the US, Russia and China, and before an international audience who contributed wisely to the question and answer session, lasted only an hour. But there emerged a substantial degree of consensus in the panel and in the room, which I suspect we will find over the next 2 days or so. My principal observation from that experience was, why beyond that with our leaders can they not find the same consensus and urgency? When people who know what they're talking about, left to their own devices, come to this consensus very quickly. So let me first of all quickly share with you my preferred current definition of strategic stability. So next week I will participate in the third of 3 sections of a RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, essentially, the MOD's think tank in the United Kingdom. And the Ditchley Foundation have had this workshop, 3 elements of it. It's been examining, to my education, the role of machine learning and autonomous weapons on strategic stability. So for our purposes, I'm adopting their definition of strategic stability, which they have worked on for a period of time. And I read it to you verbatim because I think it's good. I mean, there are others, but I prefer this one. So I read this to you verbatim. It's a couple of paragraphs. There are various rival definitions of strategic stability. The one used for this workshop is provided by Albert Wohlstetter in the 1959 Foreign Affairs article, Delicate Balance of Terror. In line with the Western tradition of military thought, Wohlstetter uses physics terminology to describe strategic concepts. This tradition goes back to Karl von Clausewitz's concept of centres of gravity and Pax Britannica concept of the balance of power. Wohlstetter describes a stable equilibrium as one that, if disturbed, could recover. In contrast, an unstable or delicate equilibrium is one which, if disturbed, quickly degenerates. Strategic stability is not, therefore, in this definition, about creating situations in which nothing disturbs the equilibrium, as this would be impossible, unachievable. There will always be crises and conflicts. The important point is that such crises and conflicts remain limited in scope. This concept reinforces the Kennan concept of containment outlined in Kennan's 1946 long telegram from the US Embassy in the Soviet Union to Washington. Kennan's concept of containment highlighted how war with the Soviet Union was unwinnable and therefore to be avoided, but so too was outright appeasement. Instead, a third way, avoiding both war and appeasement, ought to be sought. And this became US policy in 1950 in line with the recommendations of the National Security Council paper. So in short, strategic stability, as a consequence of my recent education and my preferred view, is not about preventing all war, it's about preventing major wars between major powers. And that's the concern that I and others increasingly are having, is that we will find ourselves in that situation. And that, I think, reflects the principal fear that is behind Bill Perry's words, to the extent that I have been exposed to long conversations with him.
We should continuously insist on preventing the deployment of medium-range missiles, first and foremost in Europe. It's hard to tell what will take place in the Pacific region, how China will respond, considering that China is Russia's strategic partner. Putin said we would not act first, only if they deploy missiles. Will we respond? But how? We'll deploy our medium-range missiles there in the Far East. But how will our strategic partner see that? What would it do? As for involving the Chinese in the negotiation process, for many years I had to deal with Chinese on all levels, generals, commanders, politicians. They are absolutely inscrutable. When we say, you have deterrent nuclear weapons, so show us what you are going to deter, they just laugh. We are open, absolutely open. but we know nothing about what they have, only expert estimates. No one protests against the published data, but we know about quantities of their weapons-grade uranium and plutonium, and in terms of strategic, and not just strategic payloads, they may match the USA. Therefore, attempts to involve China in these processes, it may be for the purpose of somehow or other avoiding all negotiations. Why is the USA insisting on it? Is it a way to avoid bilateral negotiations with Russia? Or is it a failure to understand? The military have always been afraid to be late. A first strike might leave them without nuclear weapons and with no second strike capability. They said the mission of the armed forces is not only to defeat an attack, but also to deliver a preemptive strike. However, today more than ever before, it becomes clear how dangerous is the intention to immediately answer back. The retaliatory counterstrike concept. Information and warnings from ground-based radar is considered the most reliable. But first the Americans, and now we too, seek to obtain extended data from the first space echelon, and not just on launch sites, but also their direction, targets, and scale, and so on. Generally, it is a fairly reliable system, but its reliability is measured in probability. To make the destinies of humankind dependent on slight chance is absolutely unreasonable. Therefore, one guaranteed prevention of such threats is increased decision-making time. The retaliatory counterstrike as a strategic concept is not so much about military equipment and military planning as about mentality, because, given a sound approach, there is no need for such a strike. Both Russia and the USA invest huge funds in the development and deployment of fail survival systems. I spoke about that at the previous meeting, and it complies with the principles of strategic stability formulated in 1990 and is still relevant, in my opinion. Nevertheless, ground-based missiles still rely on a retaliatory counterstrike. The question is, why? To kill several dozens of millions of enemy citizens more than otherwise? Is it worthwhile, considering the creation of a probability of nuclear war through a tactical error, wrong interpretation of the opponent's actions? To my mind, it is not. Another argument is that the military political leadership may be vulnerable and may fear that in the event of a sudden attack, there will be no one left to order a retaliatory strike. That is the theme to discuss, and probably to invest more money, not in missiles and aircraft, but in improved ability to survive, duplication, a sound system for the delegation of authority, to avoid fears that at any moment we will be destroyed and who will retaliate. It might diffuse the issue and thus change the leaders' mentalities. Luxembourg Forum experts say that the right and much safer way is to develop less vulnerable systems. The purpose of a headquarters, and I have repeatedly emphasized this, is to develop dozens of different plans, first strike plans of various scale, with different target assignments, retaliatory counterstrike plans, a retaliatory strike plan that should also include various scenarios for the potential use of different quantities of nuclear means. If a headquarters does not develop such plans, it means that they are not worth their wages. It is their responsibility to do that. But a decision to use nuclear weapons is the prerogative of political leadership. At some point, first strike plans were a priority, when there were many leaders and military men who had seen action. I remember how in Luga's State Committee, where I was invited to discuss whether or not ballistic missile defense was needed, and they said that my report was very convincing. I was approached by a Vietnam War veteran in a wheelchair who said, "Yes, you are right. But what if something happens like the 7th of December? Not just Americans, but we too have the surprise strike syndrome." All our commanders, including one of the recent ones, to say nothing of Zhukov and others, Marshal Grechko, told me, "We will strike first or deliver a preventative strike. We cannot allow another June the 22nd. That is a deeply rooted mentality, but times have changed. Though it is commonplace, arms control treaties improve political interstate relations. In the last 75 years, for us, arms control treaties were the most important aspects of improvement in Moscow-Washington relations. They have a much stronger psychological effect on political leaders than anything else, more than regional agreements on local wars or any general security agreements, because by them, leaders bilaterally limit the systems capable of destroying each other, systems that are the core of national security. The importance of such effect should not be underestimated, commonplace or not. The present Cold War and arms race between Russia and the USA is not driven by Ukraine, Syria, or such other issues alone. They are also caused by the absence of any negotiations on this important matter for 10 years. We have drifted miles and miles apart, and now each action by the other party is seen as a threat.
In the U.S.-Russia relationship, it seems to me, and this is a link to crisis instability as a part of strategic stability, what we really need at this point is some kind of a pause or some kind of intermediate approach that will give us some time to think through the issue at a point where the politics of it doesn't really allow us to make a lot of progress. In the project at the Academy that I've referred to on managing the challenges of a new multipolar nuclear world, the last part of it will be a Daedalus issue that will come out in April. And one of the authors in that is Jim Timby, and I think most of the people around the table have high respect for Timby as a man who's thought long and hard in very practical ways about the problem. The task he was given is if formal treaty-based nuclear arms control in the U.S.-Russia, never mind U.S.-China relationship, seems out of the question anytime soon, then what in order to deal with these issues? And he's written a very interesting piece with a lot of specific ideas, but on the point I've just raised about arms race instability, a pause, giving ourselves some time, he proposes that there be an agreed, at least informally, agreed in moratorium on increasing warhead levels across the board. All powers agree to that. Now, I realize there's a transparency issue with the Chinese, and he would even create as an incentive for that on the U.S. side and the Russian side a slight further reduction from 1550 warheads to 1250 warheads. That's his proposal. Now, I don't know whether that's doable, but in terms of the effort of the Luxembourg Forum, shouldn't one of our objectives in terms of arms race stability be thinking of steps by which we can get some kind of a pause in these processes, even though warhead limitations are part of the old approach, quantitative, which in the long run isn't going to be adequate for strategic arms control, but nonetheless would contribute in terms of dealing with the arms race instability and its effect on our future ability to deal with crisis stability.
So what recommendations does the Supervisory Board of the Luxembourg Forum offer to heads of state, the UN, and other major international organizations? First of all, we recommend the extension of START 3 for 5 years, as provided for by the treaty. We believe that today there are prerequisites for that. The treaty is extremely advantageous for Americans, for instance, because in accordance with the treaty, they gain total control of strategic nuclear forces, under which 18 inspections may take place every year on each side. And the Americans in particular are accorded full facilities for inspecting our ballistic missiles. With rocket fairings dismantled, they can count the number of warheads, see whether they are nuclear or non-nuclear, as there are relevant sensors. The same is true for sea-based missiles and inspections of strategic bombers. Dozens of notifications about what we are going to do, when and what we are going to launch, move, remove from combat alert forces, or deploy. The fact that they inspected our new guided missile system with a supersonic unit shows that the chances are that our new weapons will not block the extension of the existing or the conclusion of a new treaty. How would the treaty benefit Russia? For Russia, it is all the more advantageous. First, because of the balance of forces. Parity is a superpower characteristic for Russia. Second, it will allow us to limit strategic nuclear forces to a minimum. And should the Americans wish to build them up, which they could easily do, as they have a huge so-called breakout potential, we will have to do the same. And this will require heavy spending, while we have financial problems as it is. You know that this year the Ministry of Defense budget was less than in previous years. So the treaty is as advantageous for us as for the Americans, only in rather different ways. What about recommendations in respect of short and intermediate-range missiles? We believe that a moratorium on the deployment of medium-range missiles is absolutely indispensable, in Europe in the first place, and it would be a good thing in Asia too, because otherwise, an arms build-up in Europe would create absolutely new and most dangerous conditions for confrontation and conflict in Europe.